Hello. Just going to go ahead and get started here, and if anybody else joins, they can get caught up with us. Just a reminder before we get started tonight, I am having a reminder about a prayer need, and that is Brandon Johnson and his wife Kara both have COVID. That's the son of Ginger and Tom Johnson. And they are in Tennessee, and he was admitted into the hospital last night to be treated. And, he has a pretty bad case of it. So he was released today with doing, with medication and some treatments to take. But keep him in your prayers and that family in your prayers going forward. Also, my stream is dropping frames tonight, so hopefully it's going to be smooth. If not, I apologize. I can't control the internet at the building. Anyway, we're going to be looking at the third sign in the book of John tonight, and that is the account of Jesus healing the paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda. And this is an interesting account in John 5, verses 1 through 18, and it sets up what Merrill Tenney, the commentator, refers to as the period of controversy, which is John chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 71. So chapters 5 and 6. And what this does is it shows the development of opposition to Jesus in the form of debate and controversy with religious leaders. And following this period of controversy, starting in chapter 7 and going all the way to the ending of chapter 11, you're going to see the controversy descend into full-blown conflict between Jesus and the Jews in John's gospel. Now, this controversy that we have here in this particular account revolves around not the undeniable miracle that takes place. They can't deny that, but rather on the day in which the miracle was performed, and from the Jews or the religious leaders' perspective, the presumed audacity of Jesus and the shocking claim that he makes. And this is going to feed into this chapter. The first part of this chapter is the account and setting up the conflict. The second part of this chapter, from verses 19 down through the end of chapter 5, is Jesus' response to the conflict by the Jewish religious leaders who are taking him to task for telling this man to do something that they would consider work on the Sabbath, and claiming that, making himself equal with the Father, God the Father, through his claims. So here's some of the, let's break this down into three reasons why the Jews get upset about this. First off, the day. The day of this particular miracle takes place on the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath day it's patterned off of creation. God worked, creative acts took place during 6 days, and he rested on the seventh. Now, God, being an all-powerful being, didn't need to rest. That just means a cessation from work. He just stopped his creative activity because it had been completed at that time. Therefore, the Sabbath is modeled upon that, and it's the day where humankind works for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, that is a day of rest and recuperation and rededication to the Lord. So it's a good day, and it served a valuable and needed purpose, especially in an agricultural setting where the tendency would be to just work like a dog all day long. During the intertestamental period, and shortly after that, the Sabbath gained really sort of legalistic tones and became a very hyper-detailed observance or series of observances that was added to by oral tradition, the traditions of the Pharisees and things of that nature. And Jesus will often remind the Jews that the Sabbath was a day of rest that was designed to benefit humanity. Man was not to be a slave to the Sabbath or to serve the Sabbath, but rather the Sabbath was made that man might find restoration and a time for rededication and reflection. we see this in Mark chapter 2, verses 27 in the New Living Translation. I rarely quote this, but I like the way it translates it. Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Pharisees were, in their zeal to observe the law appropriately, they were flipping it up on its head, and the intention was wrong, and mankind became slaves to the Sabbath rather than the Sabbath being something that was there to benefit man. So that was the day, and the day of this particular miracle was one part of the controversy. A second aspect of the controversy of this particular miracle is the audacity, and that is Jesus is basically, by telling the lame man that he just healed to pick up his mat and to walk, he's basically telling them to ignore the traditions that are binding upon him, that he couldn't do that without violating Sabbath tradition. But since this was a Sabbath and Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus was commanding him to break not God's law or God's regulations about the Sabbath, but rather Pharisaic traditions regarding the Sabbath, which were, if you ever read the Talmud, you're going to know that it's quite strict and burdensome. They have just a remarkable amount of things that came in that they prohibited during the Sabbath observances. So the first point in contention was the day, the Sabbath. The second point was the audacity of Jesus to tell someone to just ignore the traditions that had developed over time. But what really got him mad was the claim. And they would say the claim was equality with God. Look at verses 15 through 18. 15 through 18. This man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father was working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, not only because he was breaking the Sabbath, but because he was even calling God his own Father, making him equal with God. By calling Yahweh his Father or my Father, he equated himself with God. Conceptually, what that means is we understand that the Son partakes of the nature of the Father. Like begets like, produces like. You're not going to find an orange tree that produces apples. And that's the dynamic that's at play here. And this is something that's going to be more clearly stated by Jesus later on in the full-blown period of conflict. John chapter 8, verse 58, that account that you often hear somebody quote, Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And in saying I am, he's referencing how God revealed himself to Moses in that very special way. And he says, "I am. Tell them I am has sent you," or something to that effect, as out of the burning bush. And when they heard this, they wanted to stone him because they knew instantly that he was saying, "I am equal with the Father." So it's really kind of an interesting dynamic here. So the day, the Sabbath, the audacity, ignore traditions, the claim, equality with God, all of these things work together to create the contention that you're going to see in the rest of this particular chapter. And after verse 18 there, Jesus' response is given to the opposition, and he's going to outline his authority to speak, and he's going to give a scathing review of their unbelief. So these are very important things. Let's, controversy aside, and we'll deal with the controversy next week because we're going to look at the miracle this week, and next week we'll look at the lengthy response that Jesus gives. The third sign here, what it does is it demonstrates the sharp difference between the crippling power of false hope and the true restorative power of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Let's go ahead and just read this passage. If you would, open your Bibles up to John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9, or you can follow along on screen. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has five roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." At once the man was healed, and he took up his bed, and he walked. Now, we'll read the rest of that as we proceed through the chapter. But I'm going to leave this text up for just a few minutes while I talk about it, and we're going to consider the first part. And what you see happening right here is a man who was paralyzed by false hope. I mean, yes, he had a physical paralysis, an actual disability, but as a result of his inability to reach this superstitious belief that he had about the water, he had descended into, he'd banked on false hope. And now he was wrecked as a result of that. The text tells us two things about the when and the where of this particular encounter. Notice in the first line, after this, there was a feast of the Jews. Well, after this refers to being after the healing that we had just looked at the last time we met in Cana with the official's son. So he goes from Cana in Galilee down to Jerusalem because there was a feast. Now, the feast in question here, which drew Jesus to Jerusalem, is unnamed, and it's led to a lot of controversy as to trying to identify which feast it is. In this text, it seems to appear on the Sabbath is when this occurs. He comes down to the feast. If the assumption is that the feast is on the Sabbath, then according to the Lexham Friends and the Lexham Geographical Commentary, in the year AD 28, the Feast of Purim fell on a Sabbath, and it was the only feast day to fall on a Sabbath between AD 25 and AD 35. So what we mean by that is there's a pretty good chance that this is the Feast of Purim. And some people would say, yeah, but that doesn't require that you go to Jerusalem. It's a minor feast. But Jesus went to Jerusalem for other minor feasts as well. He was there for the Festival of Lights, what we would call Hanukkah. And I believe it's John 9. So anyway, he's there regardless. Purim was a festival that commemorated the deliverance of the Jews in Persia from the genocidal plot of Haman. So it's sometimes called Mordecai's Day in the intertestamental writings. And that's in Esther chapter 9, verses 26 through 32, where it's instituted. So a good guess would be Purim. And that's the one that I tend to go with. So that's when it occurred. Where did it occur? The text also tells us, if you look in the first line again, in Jerusalem by the sheep's gate, a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda. Now, Bethesda means house of mercy or house of outpouring. Beth in Hebrew is house. So when you see Bethel, the house of God, and that kind of thing like that. This pool was located in an area that, and right now they've found the remains of this pool under the remains of an ancient monastery in the northeast quarter of the old city near what is known as the Sheep Gate. And the Sheep Gate is pictured as being rebuilt by some people in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1. Now, when you look at what the pool looks like, and here's a reconstruction of what Jerusalem would have looked like right there. You see that there were this in the very background, you see kind of in the upper left, you see a road leading to a hole in the gate. That would be the Sheep's Gate, the Sheep Gate. These are the colonnades. You see four, the colonnades pictured there with the dividing wall. There were two pools lying north and south, surrounded by four colonnades in a rough trapezoid shape, with the fifth colonnade separating the two pools. So we don't know which of these two pools that's being referred to here, but this is a model of what the area would have looked like that they came to. So this is where it takes place. And there's an interesting legend that developed about these twin pools that we find in some versions of the text. Now, if you have a New King James Version or a King James Version, and I was reading through that text earlier, then there was a lot of words missing in what I read versus what you have. Here is the text that's missing in the ESV and most modern translations. And that is in John chapter 5, 3, and 4. And 4 is almost wholly omitted in most newer translations. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. And this is the new part. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. So Bibles that follow the King James tradition include this unmarked. Some that do not, like the New American Standard, include this in brackets that clearly identify this is a suspect piece of text. Most newer Bibles omit it and include it in a footnote. Now, the writer, John, or whoever wrote this, does not include it because it was an accurate statement that an angel actually went down and the water was miraculous in some way. But rather it's there to explain why the people gathered there. This was a superstitious belief that the stirring of the water was caused by an angel. In reality, it's believed to have been caused by the periodic influx of spring water. And some archaeological journals and things will note that the water is often reddish, which indicates a high mineral content. So that's what's happening right there. This is a scribal addition this is believed to be a scribal addition that has worked its way into the text over time that explains why people showed up at this particular thing. So that's important to keep in mind as we go through this. And the presence of the paralyzed man and the others that Jesus sees there in physical need demonstrate really the crippling power of trying to find help in vain superstitious beliefs. The text tells us that he was paralyzed for 38 years. Now that's almost as long as Israel wandered the wilderness. And it pointed to the depth of his spiritual and social alienation. Notice in the text he says himself, when Jesus says, "Do you want to be well?" He says, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the water." And it's easy to feel that alienation at times. I can tell you, it's easy to feel that alienation at times. You see that he's a man who's been burdened by the false hope in this local superstition. And so strong was this superstition that it persisted after AD 70. And in fact, in the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, the Romans erected a pagan altar there to the healing god Asclepius. And it's believed that that may have been there prior to the destruction of the temple. And if that's the case, then Jesus healing the man at Bethesda may, and I say may because we don't know for sure, but may be a demonstration of his power over like false conceptions and superstition. The false power to heal, the false hope versus the true power to heal, the true power to restore, true hope through Jesus. The point of this is regardless of the reality, the man believed it to be real and wasted his years sitting there invested in a false hope that was never going to come true. He had wrongly attributed divine action to natural occurrences. And believing these things to be, just out of reach, he descended into hopelessness. Can you imagine if you believed that by some chance you could get into that water first, you would be able to walk, and your entire life would be changed? 38 years worth of downtrodden badness, but you just couldn't get there before people who were more mobile. How would that wear on you? over time. This belief was just as worthless as any other superstition that you find throughout time. And his loneliness and his hopelessness is seen in his blaming of others for his continued condition. Look at verse 7. He says, I have no one to put me in the pool. So he transfers the guilt and the burden, the cause of his hopelessness on others. Merrill Tenney put it this way in the Expositor's Bible Commentary. He said, the reply in verse 7 reveals the man was placing the blame for his condition for what somebody else had not done for him. The paralysis of body was combined with the partial paralysis of will. Going back to the superstition thing, how many people today do the same thing? How many people today ascribe divine action, divine causality to natural things with no evidence or regard whatsoever? How many blame others for their continued problem? Miracle cures, healing crystals, oils with supposed spiritual properties, copper-infused clothing and jewelry, whatever it might be. People turn to such things out of a desperate hopelessness in order to try to get a glimmer of hope. Jesus is going to show this man where true hope resides. And despite the despair and the alienation, one encounter with Jesus would turn this man completely and his world upside down. And he would move from hopelessness to hope, not through the power of positive thinking or through the power of crystals or through the power of whatever it might be, but by the power of Jesus Christ to heal and to restore. And that's what we see. We see this man being restored by the power of Jesus in verses 8 and 9. Verses 8 and 9. Well, let's just start right in the middle there. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want me to be healed? Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed, and he walked. He was restored by the power of Jesus. The turning point in this man's life was the command of Jesus and the willingness to trust and to respond appropriately to what Jesus instructed him to do. He didn't know who Jesus was. According to the text in 5:13, the authorities come and question, "Hey, what are you doing carrying that stuff?" "Oh, some man told me to carry it, the man who healed me." "Well, who was the one who healed you?" "Well, I have no idea who he is." That's what we see in verse 13. I often think about that. Was there some physical change that took place that let him know that Jesus' words were powerful and authoritative? Like, was the numbness suddenly replaced with feeling? Well, we can't tell that from the text. We can just assume that such might be the case. Did he obey Jesus because of some sort of cult of personality? Jesus' presence was such that he was willing to give it a try. Again, don't know. We can only know that he was made whole by the power of Jesus. And, you see Jesus quoting this of himself in Luke chapter 7:22. John the Baptist in prison, having a moment of doubt, sends some messengers to Jesus who is around the town of Nain, and he asks them to get proof and says, "Are you the one who was to come, or are we to look for another?" And Jesus says to those and tell them to go tell John. It says, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have the good news preached to them. In other words, Jesus says, this is part of what I came to do. This is my messianic identity. There you go. And really, it's kind of interesting because when he talks about the lame being made to walk, he's really alluding to a passage that we find in Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. Now, that's a passage that speaks to the restoration of Israel, of God's people, the restoration of God's people. And he's applying this to his work as Messiah, restoring, in a larger sense, man through him. Israel physically, but also to be included Gentiles later spiritually. And that is in Isaiah 35, 5 through 6. And it says, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy, for waters break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert." In other words, the blessings of God are just flowing out, and people are being restored. That's the figurative picture that we see here, and Jesus applies this to his ministry. And with this one encounter, the word of Christ healed and restored the man, something that superstition could never, ever do. And many people similarly blind themselves to superstition today, believing that God is in those things. And they remain spiritually crippled as a result. For Jesus alone is the way, the truth, and the life. You're not going to find a crystal that will ever do what Jesus could do, or an oil, or some sort of ointment, or whatever it might be. And I think the most interesting and comforting thing of this particular passage right here is found in verse 6. And it's the fact that Jesus knew what this man needed before he even asked. It says, when he saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time. He knew. Jesus had just encountered him, yet he knew. And when we feel alone and neglected and dejected, abused, burdened by life, whatever it might be, remember that our living God, that Jesus Christ, knows your needs well, and that he cares for us and desires that we turn to him to find help. And in helping the paralyzed man, he shows that he showed clearly that he was willing to help the helpless and to give hope to the hopeless. He looked at the man's plight and was not repulsed. He had compassion on the man. He had true empathy, which is something that Jesus is often pictured as having. Matthew 9:36 says that when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. Jesus had true empathy for others. And he made time to meet that man's needs. Wholeness. And afterwards, in verse 14, Jesus finds the individual that was healed in the temple, talking to the Jews, the religious leaders. Maybe he was there offering whatever sacrifice needed to be offered in order to be rendered clean, ceremonially clean. Maybe he already had and he was worshiping. Maybe he was just expressing joy for the greatness of what God had done for him through Jesus. And I think this is such an amazing reminder for the church right now in the way in which we reach out to others who are similarly separated, troubled, and in need, that we need to look to their plight. We need to be empathetic for their plight, and then we need to make time to meet the needs associated with lifting someone from that plight. And that begins with directing them to Jesus first and foremost. But it doesn't stop there. And this is just such a beautiful passage. But from the beauty of this passage, we see controversy. Controversy is going to build up in verses 9 through 18. Now that day was the Sabbath day. And I love the way that in the ESV it separates it on a different paragraph, because that phrase is setting up the contention that's going to follow. Now that day was the Sabbath day. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." Now, we don't know if the man had sinned. There's no evidence to suggest that he was blind for 38 years because of sin. In fact, in John 9, when they find a blind man, they're like, "Is this guy blind because his parents sinned?" And he says, "No, this guy's blind because, the greatness of God was going to be shown in him. It was going to be an opportunity for Jesus to demonstrate the power that he had, that people might praise God." So there's an interesting thing to that. So we don't want to get carried away with that statement. It is a sound warning, though. See you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why, and I have this bolded for a reason, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Notice it says all the more to kill him. They already wanted him gone. They were already bothered by what Jesus did. Now they were just agitated to the point that they wanted to pursue it wholeheartedly. They wanted to kill him all the more because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So we see that, and we see the controversy that comes about as a result of Jesus doing really a wonderful thing. And rather than seeing joy at a man who was restored, both spiritually and socially, the Jews desired contention. And when you see the term "the Jews" in this setting in the book of John, it most often refers to Jewish religious leaders, specifically the Pharisees. And they would have been the people who would have taken a keen interest in the man who would have been walking and carrying his mat on the Sabbath day, because they would have seen that as breaking the boundaries that they had established for their Sabbath observance, the traditions of God. And when they say, "Why are you carrying your mat? Why are you doing this? Who told you to do this?" They're basically asking, by what authority are you doing this? And this is the same question that was posed to John the Baptist earlier in chapter 1, verses 24 and 25. Well, if you're not the Christ and you're not Elijah, why are you baptizing? By what authority are you doing this? Also of Jesus after he cleansed the temple. By what sign will you show us that you can do this? By what authority are you doing this? And when you look back at the Old Testament Sabbath commands, they seem a little bit harsh, because if you violated them, you could be put to death. And they put in these extra traditions to prevent that. So there's a good intention behind this pile upon pile of extra ordinances that the law never included. And if you're curious what some of those things are, what some of the original Sabbath command would have been, it's in Exodus 31, 12 through 17. But when you look at the harshness of that particular passage, I'm going to read a little bit of that. Exodus 31, 12 through 17. And the Lord said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord, that I, the Lord, sanctify you. And you shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. And that idea of whoever does work on that, they extended it to anyone. Like you couldn't open a sealed jug on the Sabbath without violating it because they would consider that work. We know that that's not work. That's just going about and living your life. That's not out plowing a field. They would have considered picking up your mat and moving it work, rather than the practical implications of, well, if he left it there, somebody would steal it. How do we know? That may be the only thing he has. So there's no room for mercy in that kind of legalistic environment that they had produced. In actuality, when you look at the law of Moses, he didn't break Sabbath regulations at all by taking up his mat and walking. He didn't break God's word anywhere. He was guilty of violating the added traditions of man. He was not culpable, nor was Jesus, of breaking the law. However, he could not tell the Jews who told him to move the mat because he didn't know who he was until Jesus came to him later. Look at verses 15 and 16. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him, because Jesus found him in the temple later and said, hey, stop, don't sin, that nothing worse may happen to you. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. And then in verse 17, Jesus responded and says, my Father is always working and is working, and I work too. And then they get upset because they think he is equating himself with the Father, in which case he absolutely is, and they're right to see that. But they're wrong to be upset with him, since he actually is the Son of God. And it makes me wonder, what are some traditions that we have that people get upset about when you suddenly decide to subvert them or to do away with them? How about the collection of trays on Sunday morning, the collection of the collection? We take a collection every week to help monetarily fund the church and the expansion of the kingdom. Some people would probably flip out and probably don't like the fact that we have a box. Because don't you know you're supposed to pass plates? We've always passed plates, although in the synagogue, which Christian worship is based off much of this way the synagogue operated, they had different boxes that you would just put your thing in. So what we're doing now is probably closer to what they actually did then, and it's much more discreet. Even digital. Some people recoil at the idea of giving digitally with your phone or whatever. Well, why is that? You're still giving, and we're commanded to store back and give as we've prospered. And you're doing that. Well, don't you know it's supposed to be in a plate? Well, where's the book, chapter, verse for that plate? Oh, wait, I'm sorry, you can't give that because that's just a tradition, a convenience that's developed over time. The moving of, if you try to move Wednesday to Tuesday night, you're liable to get some people upset. Because don't you know, we're supposed to have it on Wednesday night. Or if you don't have a Wednesday at all, suddenly you're a liberal church. Well, where did Wednesday come from? Tuesday's as good as Wednesday's, as good as Thursday, is as good as Saturday or Monday. We are commanded to meet on the Lord's Day on Sunday, and we do that. So I find it quite interesting. And none of those things and opinions about those things meet or have the backing of divine authority. And perhaps, I think the challenging thing about, if we stop and look at this, is we might find too much of ourselves at times in the mirror of Scripture by looking at what the Pharisees did with regards to the Sabbath laws. Don't you know preachers are always supposed to stand at the back of the building and greet people on the way out? Book, chapter, verse says no. But tradition in the church says you better be doing it or somebody's going to get upset with you. Don't you know it's shameful when a preacher doesn't wear a coat and a tie? Jesus didn't wear a coat and a tie. Don't you know that communion bread always goes on the left side and must be served prior to the sermon? Because if you serve it after the sermon, well, then we've upset the apple cart. Oh, that isn't a faithful songbook, so we don't want to use that. We're only going to use this songbook because that particular songbook is the faithful one. We look at the Pharisees and we are super judgmental towards the Pharisees. I think we need to be very careful at times as we look at our own lives. And I have my own things that I struggle with as well. So it's something that we need to be, one thing that I've always kind of found interesting, and we had a friend who was a missionary over in Scotland, came back to preach at the Sand Springs Church of Christ and didn't give an invitation at the end, and everybody was like, what? What's going on here? There's no invitation. Well, that's because offering an invitation at the end of a sermon is tradition, not something that makes a sermon scriptural or approved by God. So I find it kind of interesting. And you know, quite frankly, we just need to take a lesson from the Pharisees here and look at the places and make sure we're not binding things from First Opinions 1:15 through 17, rather than making that greater importance than God's Word. And I think that's something to remember right there. Now, because of what you see happening right here, controversy will explode on the scene. And Jesus will address the Jews regarding his reasoning and authority to tell the man to pick up his bed and walk. And he's going to explain all this, and then, hey, he's very pointed when it comes to that. Next week, we're going to outline that response starting in verse 19 of chapter 5, going down to the end of the chapter. We're going to outline his response to the antagonistic Jews, and we're going to see what lessons we can learn from it. That's all I have for tonight, and I appreciate you tuning in. Please remember to keep Brandon Johnson and Kara Johnson in your prayers as they have COVID and are being treated for that. And please keep those people on our own list in your prayers as we go forward as well. Anyway, I hope you have a good evening, and I will see you on Sunday.